The winter of 1887 came down on the Blackwood territory like a hammer. It was a cold that did not knock before it entered. It simply seeped through the thickest logs and the most carefully packed chinking. It moved like a thief in the night, stealing the warmth from hearths and the breath from sleeping lungs. For the settlers of Stony Creek, a small, hopeful scar in an endless forest, survival was measured in cords of wood and the depth of the frost on the inside of their window panes. The cold was a physical presence, an invisible predator that hunted the unwary and the unprepared. It made iron brittle and men's tempers shorter. It painted the world in shades of white and blue, a beautiful and lethal landscape where the silence was broken only by the crack of a frozen tree limb or the howl of wind that sounded like a hungry wolf. The cabins of Stony Creek were built as their fathers had built them, square, sturdy, with thick log walls and gently sloping roofs meant to hold a blanket of insulating snow. They were monuments to tradition, to a way of doing things that had worked before, in other places, in other, gentler winters. But this land was different. The cold here had teeth. Inside the cabins, families huddled close to roaring fires that consumed wood at an astonishing rate. The heat was a liar. It blasted the faces of those near the hearth while their backs remained cold, a constant reminder of the siege laying just outside their walls. Drafts cut through the rooms like knives. At night, water left in a bucket only a few feet from the fire would be skinned with ice by morning. The settlers fought back with stubbornness and toil, felling more trees, splitting more logs, feeding the insatiable hunger of their fireplaces. It was a losing battle, and with every passing week, the wood piles shrank and the fear grew. This struggle was universal in the small settlement. From the cabin of the blacksmith, whose mighty arms could split a log in a single blow, to the home of the preacher, who prayed for deliverance from the biting air, the story was the same. They were all losing ground. They followed the old ways because they were the only ways they knew. A house was a box to keep the weather out. A fire was a flame to make heat. The logic was simple, direct, and, as the winter deepened, tragically flawed. They had built their fortress walls, but the enemy was already inside, living in the very air they breathed. Among them lived a woman named Elara. She had arrived 2 years prior with her husband, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that saw the world in lines and angles. He was an engineer from the old country, a place where they understood the geometry of survival and the physics of cold. He had seen the unforgiving nature of this new land, and had spent his first winter not just surviving, but observing. He filled notebooks with sketches of wind patterns, snowdrifts, and the path of the low winter sun. He had a dream of a different kind of house, a house that did not fight the winter, but instead made an ally of it. He had died of a fever that spring, leaving Elara with their 2 small children, a collection of strange notebooks, and a memory of his quiet confidence. Now, facing her second winter alone, Elara saw the truth in her husband's drawings. She saw the failure of the traditional cabins not as a mystery, but as a problem of design. Her own small cabin, built like all the others, was a cold prison. Her woodpile, though carefully managed, was dwindling faster than she could replenish it. The sight of her children, huddled under every blanket she owned, their breath pluming in the air inside their own home, forged her quiet grief into a cold, hard resolve. She would not let this winter take them, too. She would build her husband's house. She laid out his plans on the rough-hewn table, the paper filled with his precise, elegant script and drawings that made no sense to anyone else in Stony Creek. It was not a square box. It was a long, low structure with one side of its roof pitched at a startlingly steep angle, almost a sheer wall, while the other side was long and sloped gently. It was asymmetrical, unbalanced, and, to the eyes of the other settlers, fundamentally wrong. The foundation was not the shallow stone piling they all used, but a deep, excavated pit meant to be filled with rock and earth. The fireplace was not a gaping hole in the wall, but a massive, central column of masonry that seemed to eat up the entire middle of the small floor plan. When she began digging the foundation in the last days of a cold autumn, the work was deemed an act of foolish desperation. Silas, the settlement's most respected builder, a man whose cabins were known for their tight joinery and straight lines, came to watch her. He was a large man, practical and proud, his hands thick with the calluses of 1,000 felled trees. He chewed on a piece of straw and squinted at the hole she was carving into the frozen earth. "That's a grave you're digging, woman, not a foundation," he said, his voice not unkind, but heavy with the certainty of his own expertise. "The ground will freeze and heave it to pieces by midwinter. You build on top of the land, not in it." Ilara did not stop her work. The shovel scraped against stone. "The earth below the frost line holds warmth," she answered, her voice even, repeating the words she had read in her husband's notes. "It is a reservoir of heat." Silas chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. He shared the look with the two men who had come with him. A reservoir of heat. It was the kind of nonsense a man might read in a book, far from the hard realities of the frontier. "The only reservoir of heat that matters is in your woodpile," he said, gesturing to her dwindling stack. "And you're wasting precious time on this folly when you should be gathering more." The mockery began then, quietly at first. They called her project Ilara's Folly. The men would stop by her plot of land on their way to the forest, axes on their shoulders, and offer her pitying advice. They spoke of the wind, how it would catch the tall, steep side of her roof and tear it from its moorings. They spoke of the snow, how its weight would surely collapse the strange, lopsided structure. The shape she drew in the dirt was an offense to their common sense. A house was meant to be balanced, symmetrical, strong in its simple geometry. Hers looked like a child's mistake, a broken-backed thing. "It's crooked," one of them said, and the name stuck. The children in the settlement began to call her the woman with the crooked house, whispering and pointing as she hauled stones from the creek bed, her back straining, her hands raw. The other women watched her from their doorways, shaking their heads. They saw a grieving widow lost in her sorrow, clinging to the mad scribbles of her dead husband. They saw a woman courting disaster for herself and her children. They offered her charity, a loaf of bread, a small portion of stew, but she politely refused. She did not need charity, she needed time. The skepticism was a wall as solid as any she was building. It isolated her. No one offered to help, save for a young man, barely a boy, who was too new to the settlement to have his opinions hardened by tradition. He would sometimes help her lift a heavy stone or steady a beam, his face a mixture of curiosity and doubt. But mostly she worked alone, from the first gray light of dawn until the cold, purple dusk drove her back to her freezing cabin. Her husband's notebooks were her guide, his voice a quiet murmur in her mind, explaining the logic behind every strange angle, every unusual material. The steep roof was not to fight the snow, but to shed it. The low, long slope was to face the brutal north wind, offering little for it to grip. The tall side would face the south, its broad surface designed to catch every precious minute of the low winter sun. The central masonry stove was not a fire, but a heart, designed to beat with slow, steady heat that would radiate through the entire home. It was all there, a symphony of purpose that no one else could hear. They only saw a crooked roof. She worked with a diligence that bordered on obsession. The digging of the foundation was the first great trial. The ground was hard, laced with roots and rocks. She used a pickaxe, a shovel, and her own unyielding will, breaking the earth inch by painful inch. While other men were hastily adding to their woodpiles or patching the chinking on their cabins for the 5th time, She was deep in a hole in the ground, lining it with the flat, heavy stones she had pulled from the creek. She was building a thermal battery, a core of mass that would absorb the Earth's slight, residual warmth and any heat from the house above, and then release it slowly, steadily. The community watched her toil and saw only wasted effort. Silas, in a gesture he considered neighborly, had finished framing a new storage shed for the settlement in the time it took her to lay the first course of stones. He pointed this out to the others. "See there?" he'd say, gesturing with his hammer. "That is how you build, fast, strong, and square. What she is doing, that is a kind of prayer, and I have never seen a prayer keep a man warm." His words were met with grunts of agreement. They were practical men, and her methods seemed anything but. When the foundation was finally done, a deep, solid bed of rock and packed earth, she began the walls. She used logs, like everyone else, but she built 2 walls, an inner and an outer, with a gap of several inches between them. More foolishness. "You're building 2 cabins, then?" someone jeered. "You'll use twice the wood for half the strength." She ignored them. Into the gap, she painstakingly packed dried moss, sawdust from the settlement's small mill, and anything else that could trap air. She was building insulation, a concept as foreign to them as the strange angles of her roof. For them, a thick log was insulation enough. That you might need more was an admission that your logs were not thick enough. The contrast was stark. The sounds from her plot of land were the patient scrape of a trowel on stone, the careful tap of a mallet fitting a joint. The sounds from the rest of the settlement were the frantic ring of axes, the hurried rasp of saws, a desperate race against the first snows. They were patching, reinforcing, piling wood higher and higher. They were shoring up a failing system. She was building a new one from the ground up. The most visible part of her innovation, the roof, was the last to be built. The pitch on the north-facing side was so shallow it was nearly flat, while the south-facing side was a steep, dramatic sweep. It required complex cuts and angles that tested her limited carpentry skills. She laid her husband's drawings on the ground, weighing them down with rocks, and measured each beam 3 times before making a single cut. It was slow, meticulous work. Silas, passing by one afternoon, stopped and shook his head in genuine disbelief. "The wind will treat that tall side like a sail," he warned, his voice now laced with a grim certainty. "It won't just take the roof, it will pull the whole house down. For the sake of your children, woman, build it right. Build it square." "It is right," she said, her voice quiet but firm, not looking up from her work. Her certainty infuriated him. It was the certainty of a fool, a zealot. He was the master builder. He had built every standing structure in Stony Creek. His word on the subject was law. He saw her refusal to listen not just as stubbornness, but as a personal insult to his craft and his authority. He walked away that day and spoke of her no more. He had offered his wisdom, and she had refused it. The consequences were now her own. As the first flakes of snow began to fall, her house was finally enclosed. It looked even stranger now that it was complete. It hunkered low to the ground, its crooked roof an odd, unsettling shape against the darkening sky. It did not stand tall and proud like the other cabins. It seemed to crouch, as if in deference to the coming winter. The settlers saw weakness. Elara saw readiness. She moved her children and their few belongings from the old, cold cabin into the new one, just as the storm clouds on the horizon began to gather into a solid, bruised wall of gray. The great storm did not arrive like a normal winter squall. It came as an invasion. It began with a wind that was not a gust, but a solid, moving wall of air. It screamed through the forest, a high, thin shriek that vibrated in the bones. The sky, which had been gray, turned a dark, churning purple-black. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding torrent of ice particles that scoured the landscape like sand. The settlers had seen blizzards, but this was something else entirely. This was a physical assault. The old-timers called it a land hurricane, a force of nature that came perhaps once in a man's lifetime to scour the world clean. Inside their traditional cabins, the families of Stony Creek felt the attack immediately. The wind found every tiny crack, every imperfection in the chinking. It forced its way in, not as a draft, but as a constant, piercing flow of Arctic air. The roaring fires in their hearths seemed to shrink, their heat stolen away and hurled up the chimney by the violent pressure changes. The log walls, which had seemed so thick and impenetrable, groaned and shuddered under the force of the gale. A fine, glittering dust of snow was driven through the walls themselves, dusting the floors and furniture with a layer of white. In Silas's home, the one he had built for his own family and considered the pinnacle of his craft, the situation grew desperate within hours. The temperature inside the main room plummeted. His wife and 3 children were wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. Silas fed the fire with a grim fury, shoving log after log into its hungry mouth. The wood, which should have lasted a week, was disappearing before his eyes. The heat it produced was a fleeting comfort, a small bubble in an ocean of cold. He could feel the cabin shaking, the roof timbers creaking under the strain of the wind and the rapidly accumulating snow. The gentle slope of his roof, designed to hold a cozy layer of insulation, was now its greatest weakness. The snow was not light and fluffy. It was dense, heavy, and driven by the wind into a solid, concrete-like mass that refused to slide off. Throughout the settlement, the same story unfolded. The community was failing. The structures they had trusted, the methods they had defended with such pride, were being broken. The noise was deafening. The shriek of the wind, the groaning of wood, the unsettling rattle of a doorframe about to give way. The cold was an invading army, and their homes were falling fortresses. Fear, colder than any wind, began to settle in their hearts. They were trapped, their woodpiles shrinking, the temperatures dropping, the storm showing no sign of abating. Meanwhile, in the Crooked House, there was a profound and unnerving quiet. The wind howled outside, but inside, the sound was muted, a distant roar rather than an immediate threat. The long, low slope of the north-facing roof met the wind's charge and deflected it, sending the main force of the gale sweeping up and over the house. The snow, which buried the other cabins, sluiced off the steep southern pitch as soon as it landed, sliding away into harmless drifts. There was no groaning timber, no shuddering walls. The house did not fight the storm. It yielded to it, redirecting its fury. The heart of the home, the massive masonry heater, was the true miracle. Earlier that day, Ilara had fed it a small, modest armful of wood. The fire had burned hot and fast for 2 hours, and then she had sealed the flue. Now, long after the fire itself was out, the tons of stone and clay that made up the heater's mass were radiating a gentle, pervasive warmth. It was not the scorching, one-sided heat of a fireplace. It was an even, ambient heat that filled every corner of the small house. The floor, built upon the deep stone foundation, was not cold to the touch. The air was still and calm. Her 2 children were asleep in their beds, breathing easily, flushed with warmth, not with fever. Ilara sat at her small table, mending a sock, the only light coming from a single oil lamp. The contrast between the violent chaos outside and the profound peace within was absolute. Her husband's theories were no longer just lines on a page. They were a living, breathing shelter. It worked. The storm raged for 2 days and 2 nights. For the people of Stony Creek, It was an eternity of cold and fear. On the second night, a roof on the far side of the settlement collapsed under the weight of the snow, the sound of it lost in the gale. Another family's wood ran out completely, forcing them to burn their furniture to stay alive. The crisis had reached its peak. The traditional ways had not just been found wanting, they had been proven lethal. In Silas's cabin, the battle was lost. His woodpile was down to a few precious logs. The inside temperature was now below freezing. Frost coated the walls in thick, fern-like patterns. His youngest child was shivering uncontrollably, his wife's face a mask of weary terror. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered. There was only one place to go, one last, desperate hope: the crooked house. He had mocked it, condemned it, and predicted its swift demise. Now he had to pray it was still standing. The stark contrast was the first thing that struck him. The interior of his own cabin was a landscape of desperation. Blankets, clothes, and furs were piled onto the beds. The fire was a pathetic flicker, consuming the last of his carefully split logs with a greedy, inefficient hunger. The air was filled with smoke and the biting cold, a mixture that stung the eyes and chilled the soul. The sounds were of chattering teeth and the relentless, deafening scream of the wind against walls that seemed as thin as paper. His family was not living, they were enduring. Their world shrunk to the few feet of marginal warmth around a dying fire. Ilara's home was another world. Her children slept soundly, their chests rising and falling in the easy rhythm of peaceful dreams. There was no frantic fire, only the immense, silent masonry stove in the center of the room, radiating a calm, steady warmth that felt like a gentle summer sun. The air was fresh and still. The only sound was the distant, muted howl of the storm, a beast kept safely outside the gates. She was using less than a quarter of the wood he was, yet her home was a sanctuary of warmth, while his was an icebox. He had built his house to be strong. She had built hers to be wise. He had been wrong. The thought was so simple, so absolute. It felt less like a conclusion and more like a physical blow. Bundling his family and every remaining layer they had, Silas made the journey. It was a brutal, short trek of less than 100 yards that felt like a mile. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the breath from his lungs. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, heavy powder that fought his every step. He carried his youngest son, while his wife and older daughter clung to him, their faces covered against the stinging ice. When they finally reached the crooked house, they were half frozen, exhausted, and on the verge of despair. He pounded on the solid wood of the door with a numb hand. The door swung open, and the warmth that flowed out was a physical shock. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a fireplace, but a gentle, humid warmth that seemed to soak into his frozen clothes and skin. Ilara stood there, her expression calm, unsurprised. There was no hint of triumph in her eyes, no trace of the smugness he would have felt in her position. She simply saw their need. "Come in," she said, her voice quiet. "There is room." Silas stumbled inside, his family collapsing behind him. He stood there for a long moment, dripping melted snow onto the clean planked floor, his eyes taking in the impossible reality of the room. He looked at the sleeping children, at the warm, dry air, at the solid, silent walls. He looked at the massive stone heater, the source of this impossible comfort. He felt the warmth rising from the floor itself, from the great thermal mass hidden beneath them. He, the master builder, the man who understood wood and stone, was standing in a home that defied every principle he had ever known. And it was working perfectly, while his own creation, the product of his life's work and pride, was failing catastrophically. The shame and awe of it struck him silent. Elara did not say, "I told you so." She did not ask him to admit his error. She simply took his wife and daughters to the warm space near the masonry stove, wrapping them in dry blankets she had waiting. She handed Silas a steaming mug of hot tea. The gesture was one of simple, profound hospitality. It was an act of grace that disarmed his pride and broke through his stubbornness more effectively than any argument could have. He sat heavily on a small wooden bench, the warmth of the mug seeping into his frozen hands, and watched her tend to his family. In that quiet moment, his world shifted on its axis. He was not the expert, he was the student, and he was in the presence of his teacher. When the storm finally broke on the third day, the world it revealed was transformed. The sun shone on a landscape buried under immense drifts of snow. The silence was absolute. From the chimney of Elara's crooked house, a thin, lazy wisp of smoke curled into the cold, clean air. From the other chimneys in Stony Creek, there was nothing. Word spread with the slow pace of men wading through deep snow. The first to emerge were shocked by the devastation. The roof of the Miller cabin was completely gone, a gaping hole open to the sky. The general store had one wall buckled inward. But the most immediate news was the sight of Silas, the proudest man in the settlement, emerging not from his own home, but from Elara's folly, his family safe and warm behind him. The sight was enough to shatter the community's hardened skepticism. One by one, then in small groups, the settlers made their way to the crooked house. They came to see for themselves. They stepped from the biting cold into the steady, unbelievable warmth. And like Silas, they were struck silent. They saw the proof of their own failure and her success, not in boasts or arguments, but in the simple, undeniable fact of comfort in the face of a lethal storm. The laughter that had once echoed around her lonely worksite was replaced by a profound, respectful quiet. They looked at the strange angles and the massive stove not as mistakes, but as mysteries they desperately needed to understand. Silas was the first to ask. He found Elara outside, checking the seams of her roof for damage. He approached her not as a master builder addressing a widow, but as an apprentice approaching a master. He held his hat in his hands, his head bowed slightly. "The roof," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "It shed the snow. It did not break." "That was its purpose," Elara said simply, her eyes on her work. "And the walls, the wind." It was like a whisper inside. "The gap is filled with moss," she explained. "It traps the air. Still air does not carry the cold." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a humility she had never seen in him before. "Teach me," he said. The words were a surrender and a plea. "I have built houses my entire life, but I have never built a home. Teach me how." That moment was the turning point for all of Stony Creek. Elara brought out her husband's notebooks. She spread the worn pages on her table, the same table where Silas's family had huddled for warmth just a day before. She did not hoard the knowledge or ask for anything in return. She shared it freely, as if it were a gift meant for everyone. With Silas as her first and most dedicated student, she explained the principles. She pointed to the drawings of the sun's low arc in winter, showing why the steep, broad side of the roof had to face south. She explained how the deep foundation drew on the stable temperature of the earth, preventing the floor from freezing and becoming a source of cold. She described the science of the masonry heater, how its winding internal flue was designed to extract every last bit of heat from the smoke before it escaped, storing that energy in its stone mass. The men of the settlement, the same men who had mocked her, now crowded into her small home, listening with an intensity born of recent terror. They asked questions. They touched the warm stone of the heater. They ran their hands along the insulated walls. They learned that a house was not just a box, but a system, an engine for living, designed to work in harmony with the world outside, not in opposition to it. The knowledge she gave them was a revelation. It was the key to their survival, and it had been there all along, in the quiet work of a woman they had called a fool. That spring, the sound of construction in Stony Creek was different. The frantic, hurried pace of the previous year was gone. It was replaced by the slow, methodical work of digging deep foundations. The ring of the axe was joined by the patient scrape of the trowel. Under Ilara's quiet guidance, with Silas acting as her foreman, the community began to rebuild. They did not just repair the storm's damage, they remade their world. The first new house to be built was a replica of Ilara's, for a family whose cabin had been utterly destroyed. Silas oversaw every cut, every joint, with the meticulous care of a convert. He checked the angles against Ilara's plans. He supervised the packing of the moss insulation. He laid the stones for the masonry heater himself. When it was finished, it stood as a second testament to the new wisdom. Over the next few years, the very landscape of the settlement changed. One by one, the old, square cabins were either retrofitted or replaced. The skyline of Stony Creek became a jagged, uneven line of steep, crooked roofs, all angled to the southern sun, all hunkered low against the northern wind. The design became a badge of honor, a symbol of their shared experience of failure and rebirth. They no longer called it Ilara's Folly. They called it the Stony Creek Angle, or more simply, the Smart Roof. The story of their survival and the widow's house traveled beyond the borders of their small valley. A surveyor, charting new territory, spent a night in the settlement and was astonished by the warmth and efficiency of the new homes. He made detailed sketches in his logbook, noting the design principles with an engineer's appreciation. A traveling preacher carried the tale to other frontier towns, speaking of it as a parable of humility and hidden wisdom. The idea began to spread, a quiet revolution in architecture, passed along not in formal blueprints, but in stories and hand-drawn sketches. The Stony Creek Angle began to appear in other cold, hard places, its distinctive shape a sign of a community that had learned to respect the winter. Ilara never sought credit or praise. She remained a quiet member of the community, her life defined by her children and her home. But her status had changed forever. She was no longer the foolish outsider. She was the wise woman, the one they consulted when a problem seemed insurmountable. Her quiet determination had become the stuff of local legend. The men who had laughed at her now taught their sons the story of the great storm as a lesson in the dangers of pride. They taught them that the strongest man is not the one who refuses to bend, but the one who knows how to listen, how to observe, and how to learn from the world around him. Years later, as the settlement grew into a proper town, with a church and a school and a new generation of children who had never known the biting cold of a badly built cabin, the legacy of that terrible winter remained. It was baked into the very foundations of their homes and into the character of their people. They had learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that tradition is only valuable when it works. They learned that true strength is not found in stubbornness, but in the willingness to change. And they learned that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places, from the quiet observations of a stranger, from the pages of a forgotten book, or from the heart of a woman with the courage to build a crooked roof, and in doing so, set her entire world straight.